Hi, welcome to another episode. Today I want to explain my view of Genesis succinctly. I've tried to discuss it with many people and in bits and pieces, and so it's not been like, um, that fully understood. And so, what I'm trying to do today is to show my understanding of Genesis, how I've come to understand it, and how I think it makes the most sense, and why I think we need to understand it this way. Now, you don't have to agree with me about this, but what I would ask you to do is to think about it honestly, not to just reject it because you don't like the idea or it doesn't fit the way you've thought. Because I come from a background of a young earth creationist, literal 6 day creationist view, the standard view. And through many reasons, which some of it I'll go over, I have slowly learned to read Genesis without bias, I hope without bias, so that I can come to a good conclusion of what it's saying. I've used many resources to do this, but I believe the framework view of Genesis is the proper one to have. And before I can start out, I need to identify some presuppositions that we have. We must understand that Genesis was written to a people who understood the world differently than we do today. That's just a fact. It's got to be a recognized fact, and we can't read it as if it's through the lens of what we would understand it. We have to think back of what a person who just walked out in the world and observed the world around him would think. And so we also don't want to think that, hey, they were stupid back then. A lot of people think, oh, people back then were so stupid. No, they weren't stupid. They just lacked information. We lack information about quantum mechanics. We're learning, but we lack information. But that doesn't mean we're stupid. You know, let's move 5,000 years in the future. What do you think people are going to think about us today with the knowledge that they have gained? And so we shouldn't think that they're stupid. We've reached the pinnacle of genius today. We've just gained a lot of information, and frankly, upon the back of a lot of ancient people. Moses wrote Genesis from a perspective that people of his day had of their world. If you went out, you observed the sky, the land around you, and the water, you would have some conclusions about that. They probably didn't understand the universe was as big as it is. They probably looked at the sky and thought that it just was a surface, and how deep it went. That I don't know. Some will make. The funny thing is, people who take a little more liberty with the Bible, they'll make the people in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis, like the cosmology they have, as some really weird stuff. And they'll even say, like, well, they believe there was windows in heaven that opened up, because there are references like in the flood and other places where it talks about the windows of heaven. But funny thing is, the same people don't want to take a lot of it literally. They don't understand a windows of heaven. They won't take windows of heaven as a figure of speech. They'll make that literal, but then other things they'll make not literal. And I think that's kind of funny. We need to be careful about that. The other thing is, I think that God should have shared the story about humanity's purpose with people of the past as well as today. People say, well, the Bible's old and outdated. Well, it's old, but that doesn't mean it's outdated. In fact, I would state that because it's old, it's probably true. Why would, if there was a God, just think there was a God, which I believe there is, and he created us for a purpose. Don't you think in the beginning of that, he would want to tell us our purpose? He would wait until we're smart enough to understand. I think that would be out of character for a compassionate, loving God who created us for a purpose and not tell us. So I think the fact that this is a very old and very logical story tells me that it is what God wanted us to know. So with this in mind, we should approach Genesis And if we think they were ignorant, it shows our ignorance. We need to realize that, be able to be smart enough to think about Genesis in a way that would make sense to them and what makes sense in our world today. So, why the framework of Genesis? The standard literal 6-day creation model pits Genesis against science. Since both sides realizes that science is ever evolving, Genesis will constantly be in a debate if we take that view. If I were the devil, that's the way I would want it to be. I would want it to be constantly a debatable thing. Secular people should not assume Genesis is outdated account of our world. And Christians should not assume that every scientific discovery that might contradict their interpretation of Genesis is a conspiracy against God. That's just not so. And we can't pick and choose what science we'll accept. Like, oh, DNA proves there's God, but the Big Bang proves that the universe is old. And so we get in these debates, and this just is a bad thing. People have always read the Bible from their perspective, and some believe that it taught that the earth was flat. And others, it seems that if you read it carefully, that they thought that the earth sat on something. They didn't understand that it was round. And that's is true. For most of the world's history, people believed the sun rotated around the earth. And so, we people read the Bible from their perspective. And as we've learned things like that the actual earth rotates around the sun, we've just adjusted our understanding of Scripture. The Scripture was never wrong. It was our understanding that was wrong. And, verses like Psalms 40 verse 5 says, "Who laid the foundations of the earth, said it should not be moved forever." You could maybe they believe that it sat on something that was fixed on pillars because it talks about pillars. But the point is not really about what type of foundation, but that the earth is fixed. It's established by God. It's not something unestablished. It's established by God. And we would probably look at that as saying, well, the earth is fixed in its orbit. That's why our lives, day after day, year after year, is the same, because it's fixed in its place by the orbit. And if they thought it was fixed in its place on a pillar, it doesn't matter to the point. The point is that the earth is stable throughout time, and that's the point of the verse, and that's the understanding of it. Now, here's one problem that I have, because that I think that needs to be answered, but no scientist that I have ever found, Christian or not, can explain distant starlight as being less than 10,000 years old. So the only conclusion I can come to is the universe is old. And I'm not going to, if I think the Bible says something, and it contradicts, if it's telling me the sky is purple, then maybe I'm misunderstanding what the Bible's trying to say, because I know it's blue. And the easiest way to understand this, people say, like, well, God created things with age, and He did, but that's not a good argument. And even you can look on the Answers in Genesis website, search for a virtual starlight. That is not a good argument. And the reason why is because light from the stars, from heaven, tell us a story, just like words tell us a story. And if those words are not true, then it's false. And if the light telling us a story is not true, it's false. And therefore, if God created a false story, He's not telling the truth. And that's why theologians reject the idea of what's called virtual starlight, or starlight that's not really real. But how can I explain this best? And the best way it was explained to me was just understanding that when you look at the sun, recently we had a solar eclipse, and when people were observing the solar eclipse, what they were watching was actually 8 minutes old. Every bit of sunbeam that hits us, and every bit of light that we observe from the sun, if If scientists are looking at a sunspot or a solar flare, whatever, it's already happened 8 minutes in the past. You go to the next nearest star and it's 4.5 light years away. So anything that we observe in that star is 4.5 years old. You just keep going out. Now, you can't just all say, well, any star that's past 6 or 10,000 light years away must not be telling us the truth when we see it change. And they do observe changes, whether visible light or invisible spectrums of radiation and stuff. So I just have to believe that the universe is old. And I think that's the way God wants it to be. Psalms 19:1 says, the heaven declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Romans 1:20, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And then Hebrews 11:3, through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made by the things which do appear. So what I'm saying here is the Bible tells us to look at our world and to believe what we see. And the funny thing is younger creationists will say, you can't deny that there's a God. If you look at creation, you look at life and how sophisticated it is, and by that you should believe there's a God. Well, I say the same thing. If you look at the universe and you see how vast it is and we can see it, then you got to believe it's old the same way. We can't be fudging around like this. We have to be consistent in it. And if the universe tells us it's old, it's old. And the other thing that we often don't think about is, what did God do before he created humans on the earth? If humans are only 6,000, were created on this earth 6,000 years ago, modern humans were created on this earth 6,000 years ago, what did God do before that? If the earth and the universe was only created 6 to 10,000 years ago, did God twiddle his thumbs in darkness? No, God's been doing things forever. And so if the universe is 13 billion years old, what is that to God? That's nothing. It tells us that God is from old, from everlasting. So I have to, when I come to Genesis, the one thing I there's many things about the life on earth and how old that life on earth is, and formations on the earth and all that stuff like that is all debatable to me. But there's one thing I cannot debate, because I've never heard anybody give an answer to it, is that the universe is less than, or is only 6 to 10,000 years old. Just is inconsistent with logic and science. Therefore, so what the framework does is it removes a rigid chronology and focuses on the origin of things. Not when everything was created, but instead who created it. Therefore, those who question the 6-day creation, if people outside say, well, God didn't create everything in 6 days, that's crazy. We know better than that. And so they reject Genesis. Well, if you have the framework view, it just is simply telling us that God is the creator of everything. And therefore, Genesis cannot be argued from a scientific point of view. Science can change, science can evolve, science can do all these things, but it will never touch Genesis if you understand it from the framework view. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to explain next what the framework view truly is. Okay, so now we're going to get to the framework, the actual framework. And in order for us to discuss this rationally, I need to address the days, because this is a big factor in understanding Genesis. And the framework view, the way I understand the framework view, my framework view, I would say, is that it reads Genesis just as literally as you would read it in a literal 6-day type understanding. We Genesis is a story. It's a story type genre that's telling us truth. It's not like a theory or a thing that describes something detailed like a scientific um, essay or something like that. It's just a story about the creation of the world, and it's historically accurate, and it's literal in the sense that everything it's saying is means literally kind of what it's describing, but it is being described in a story. And so, what do we do with these days? Um, the early Earth, young creationists, and the standard view is that the 6 days represent a chronology. It's it's a chronology based view of Genesis chapter 1. The framework view is an event based chronology, so that each day isn't about how much time something took, but that it is using to the days as a way of remembering or describing an event. And the best way I can illustrate this is like in America, we have what's called the 4th of July. And so on, like, we could, think, and this is just, I mean, this didn't really happen, but, if God's in charge of everything and nations rise and fall on him, then we could kind of say this, that on the 4th day of July in 1776, God set forth to create a nation independent of Britain that would put him as the center of human rights. And so then God would say, it could be said, I should say it that way, it could be said that on every 4th day of July, you shall remember the day that God declared a nation. Now, we obviously know, if we know our history, that didn't all happen on the 4th day of July. But we do use the 4th day, a literal 24-hour day, and some extend it into the night. So, with fireworks, but we do have the 4th of July, and we do have a literal 24-hour day that we remember an event, remember something in history. And we do this with Memorial Day, we do it with Labor Day, we do it with, Christmas, the 25th of December, New Year's Day, and on and on. There's so many days that we use days as for events. And so we have, like, you could say we have a chronology in our modern calendar, but we also have an event calendar. Like, our calendar has events in it. And so this day, this event, and this day, that event. But it doesn't mean that everything that happens in that event took place within the 24-hour period. Now, this doesn't mean that then these days could be, these days represent millions of years. They could, but they could also represent a 24-hour period, that everything took place within that 24-hour period, or it could took place in a month or a week or whatever. It does not worry or describe the time that the event took place. Like, how long did it take for the dry land to appear? It could have taken a month. It could have taken a day. It could have taken 2 hours. It could have taken, 10 years. It doesn't really matter. What the day 3 is describing is an event that God caused dry land to happen on the earth. And so we need to kind of then go back and let's start at Genesis chapter 1 and see how this pans out. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form. So God makes these statements, and God said, this is a repeated statement. When God's going to do something new, some new act of creation, it starts out with, and God said. But you'll notice, if you're a careful reader, you'll notice there's nowhere that says, and God said, let there be a planet Earth. Let there be an earth. There isn't. It says, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. So we assume this is a starting place for which God's going to do something. Not that it is one of the events that took place. It's a starting place. Like Michelangelo was brought in this great stone, and it was the starting place for his statue of David. Um, and you would say, and Michelangelo beheld the stone that was formless and void, and in his mind he began his work. And that's the way I think the best understanding of these of verses 1 and 2 is that God started with a place. Now, let's also think about it this way. There's planet Mars out there that humans want, I think is rather foolish, but humans think they can colonize. But you would say that, and in the beginning, God saw Mars, and it was without form and void. And so then God would do a work on planet Mars to make it into the planet of life. And that's the way I think the most natural reading of Genesis chapter 1 and 2 says. Now, in Genesis chapter 2, it has two important words that describes the state of the earth at this time. It was formless and without void. And that's where we get this framework view, because it frames out the formless and void. So the first 3 days of the Genesis account addresses the formlessness of the earth. The second 3 days address the void of the earth. And let's just go over this real quick. Day 1, let there be light. And God said, let there be light. And he divided the light from darkness. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening, morning with the first day. So people have wondered, what is this source of light? And I think that I've often wondered why that's so complicated, why that's so mysterious. And it leads me to, over the 40 years that I've been listening to sermons and I've been reading and I've been studying myself, I've realized early on when I went to Bible colleges, we seem to view the Bible as a bunch of disconnected pieces. We have one piece over here, one piece over there. Well, the piece we need to understand day 1 was given to us by John. In John chapter 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was in the beginning with God. And it says, and this Word was the life which was the light of men, or the light which was the life of men. So what John is telling us is the light that came into day 1 was the light that brought life into the world. And light and darkness are talked about over and over and over again in the Bible as like good and evil, truth and error. Light is good, darkness is bad. And so if light brings life, then it has to also bring then the things that are needed for life. And in order for life to exist on this earth, for it to be light, there needs to be laws. There needs to be laws that govern how life works. And also there needs to be laws that govern what is good about the world, what should be good about the world, and what should be bad about the world. What is good, what is bad, what is that we need that structure of morality, of right and wrong. And that's what God defined through his Son on day 1. Jesus declared what was light, and that was pictured as dividing light from darkness. And this defined structure that was needed for the world to exist. And that structure took place on day 1. The second day, we have the structure of the waters being divided, which create the sky. And it's obvious what the water is above. It's not some water in outer space. They wouldn't even have known that. Just a common observation is that water in the sky comes from clouds. And there's many verses, which is beyond the scope of me now, but there's many verses that make it clear that they understood that water comes from the clouds. And so the water above is the water in the clouds, the water below, which was what remained in the lakes, the rivers, and the oceans. And there's a gap in between. And so we have this structure again. We have a structure. It's not, the earth is getting form to it. Now we have this expanse between the waters above and the waters below. Day 3, now God creates dry land. And so the dry land appears, and there's plants. And so now day 1, 2, and 3 have created structure for which God now wants to fill those voids. And so the second set of days, are days that are used to fill the void. And so one of the struggles, the big struggles with having an old universe is day 4, because the kind of a typical reading of day 4 would be that God creates the sun, moon, and stars on day 4. But there is another view, and John C. Collins, in one of his books that I know that John Lennox, in his book 7 Days Divided the World, he comments on this too, that what you can also interpret day 4 as not the creation of these entities, but rather they are given a role of governing our time. And what's interesting is that on day 1 it says God divides light from darkness, and on day 4 it says that these entities are to divide the light from darkness. He's not dividing the light from darkness twice. What he's doing is, the day 1 was a setup to do that, but it is the sun, moon, and stars that actually do this, and how they do it for us. Because remember, day 1 was to define structure, rules for our world, and what rules we need especially is time. We need time. And again, the days of the other reason we have to believe there are 6 literal days with a 7th day for rest is because that's how we live our lives. We live our lives by a week. And Moses wanted to tell us in Genesis chapter 1 that God created everything. There's not one thing that God did not create, and that one of those things is the week itself. It is God who created the week. And so Moses is using these days to define, not only define as events, but he's also defining that God created a 7-day week. And so it's the sun, moon, and stars that determine our time. They don't determine the days of the week. I mean, how many days we have in a week, but they do determine our days, when the day starts, when it ends, when our year begins and when it ends, what season it is. These entities in the skies are given the responsibility of doing that for us on day 4. So that answers the void. What is the objects? What is it that will give structure to our life from the perspective of order through light? Day 5, God then fills the void of this expanse between the waters with birds, and he also fills the waters with sea life and creatures that live in the waters. Obviously, on day 6, he creates all that dwells on the land, so he fills the void of the land. So this is the framework view. It's not a chronology-based view, it's an event-based view. And basically, Moses is telling us that God created everything, and he addressed, when he did it, he saw that the world was without form, so he addressed that, and then he addressed the issue of things needing to fill the forms, the void. You build a house, now you need people to occupy the house. You create a business and you have jobs, now you put someone into the role of that job. And so this is how things work, and this is how God worked. And so it, like I said in the other part, is, in conclusion, kind of this way of looking at Genesis alleviates the arguments from science, like how long did it take God to create this? How long did that? It doesn't really matter. What does matter is that Genesis describes, and this is what you have to figure out if you believe it or not, that it is one God who created everything. Or did the other option is there was many gods, which I don't know of anybody who believes in that. Well, maybe some people do. Or that there was no gods and it all happened by chance, which is, in me, the most ridiculous thing in the world to think that. I can't even fathom that. So I just default that there is a God, and I believe Genesis chapter 1 that he created everything, and Moses did an awesome job because he was inspired by God to tell this story in a way that makes so much sense and so readable and so memorable. Because think about it, because if you remember that day one is the day that light was into the world, meaning truth, goodness, and righteousness, and that then you remember, well, what is it? What light? How does light govern our world? It governs our world through the sun, moon, and stars. That's what light does. And then day three, well, if you remember day four, what happened? Well, the birds were created. Oh yeah, that means that day two must be that's where he created the expanse. And then you think, well, I know that God created animals on day four. They live on the dry land. Oh, then that was day three. So it is such a it is a marvelous story, and it is a profound story, and it is not an ignorant story. It is brilliant by any stretch of the imagination. It is a brilliant piece of literature, and if we understand it that way and we stop arguing about science and how long things took and all that, I think that's important. But if we just leave that alone, that's a separate subject, and just focus on what Genesis is trying to teach us in this framework view, I think we're going to win many more people to Genesis, and they're going to see this and rationalize it way easier than if we try to force them to say, well, you have to believe that the earth was created in so many days and all this stuff happened this way. And I'm going to try to find all the science to prove it to you. And you shouldn't believe those people who have science that discredits it. That goes away. And people just can focus on and decide for themselves. Is it a God who created all this stuff? Or is it by chance? Thank you for listening to this. I hope it makes sense. I hope that you ponder it. You don't just reject it, because I know when I first started this journey, I would get stressed out when things didn't line up with the way I thought it was supposed to. And it's like, you're messing with my worldview. Don't do that. But I had to have an open mind. I had to pray. I had to let God teach me. And this is what I came up with. So thanks for listening. I hope you have a great journey in your walk with God. I hope God blesses you. I love you. I know God does too. And would you share this with other people? I would so much appreciate it. I know I'm not the best speaker, but I hope that what I have said is valuable. And if it's valuable, then you need to share it with others. Love you. Bye.